Evening, everybody. On behalf of Azim Premji University, I thank you all for your keen participation in the two-day event on crafting justice. We welcome you all to the keynote panel discussion on sustainable models of experiential justice education. This series of events is a culmination of a 9-month-long exercise that our students have been engaged in, and they've deeply been engaged in this exercise, which has expanded the understanding of both education as well as forms of practice and different forms of justice and meanings of justice that are embedded therein. With this deeper understanding and a whole series of questions, we are today delighted to welcome a highly eminent set of panelists for the keynote panel discussion. I'd like to request Abhayraj Naik to take over as moderator. So we welcome you all once again and look forward to a keen participation from you all once again.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here. I've promised my lovely panel today that I'm going to be a bit militant about time because we have a lot of very interesting people with a lot of very interesting ideas. And the first requirement of being militant about time is, as a moderator, I mince my words henceforth, so you're not going to hear me speak too much today. And I think some of you all have heard me speak a fair bit in the morning. This panel is, in a sense, the question that has inspired us and the question that continues to make us strive towards finding answers to questions that perplex us, right? So in a sense, this is the panel that we hope will give us some clarity as we head back to our homes and hotels today. And without any further ado, I would like to invite Ajay Pandey to speak first. I'll request all my panelists to restrict their comments to 12 minutes if possible. I know that's ridiculously limited, okay? And that's what we are aiming at, 12 minutes accelerated in fitting for an event at NUMA. I'd also request you to spend a little bit of your 12 minutes telling us about yourself. I know all of you, I know your work, but it would be good if you could share with our audience a few words about what interests you and what you're up to presently. So over to you, Ajay, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you, Abhayraj, and good evening, all of you. I am supposed to first say a few words about myself. I teach law at Jindal Global Law School. I was teaching there as full-time for the last 7 years, and then I took a break now. I work full-time with rural communities in Haryana. There is a region called Mewat. A part of it is in Haryana and a part in Rajasthan. We work there with in actually about 400 villages, and then that work has now gone beyond that region. It has gone to Bihar. So we work in a couple of districts in Bihar as well, and there are about 60 villages where we are working currently. So it's Haryana, Rajasthan and Bihar, and about 500 villages. Abhayraj actually engaged with this work initially when he was at Jindal in 2009. And when we had started this work, and when he engaged, in fact, with us, the work was in 6 villages, and now it has crossed the mark of 500 villages. Now, I'll quickly come back to the uh, topic uh, of the discussion this evening. Um, and I think one question that I need to really answer is, before I begin talking, is why experiential learning? I think that question is really important, and this is how I answer it, and this is how I engaged in experiential learning. Um, and this is with a concern, uh, a concern of a person who has been associated with law for over 20 years now, uh, in various capacities. And that concern is that there's a clear disconnect between what law promises to people and what actually happens in reality. So now the challenge is how to make law and its promises real. Uh, so that's a challenge. Now, when we look at the most fundamental promise of law in India, that is the guarantee of of a dignified life to every individual, to every citizen, not just citizen, every person who is present on the soil of India. And that's the guarantee, that's the promise. And when I talk about as a law teacher now, and as a person associated with law for over 20 years now, when I talk about the most fundamental provision of law in India, my feet tremble, because I know what I am talking about cannot be law, maybe fiction, because it doesn't happen, it doesn't exist. And I pose this question to my colleagues and my students, that are we into some kind of fiction? Now, if we have to address that serious concern of how to make law real, I don't think that this can really happen without experiential learning and without engaging with communities, and not just engaging with communities, but seeking their effective participation in processes of law. I have said that there's a disconnect, but this was something which I used to say some 9 years back, when I started engaging with communities more effectively. What I say now, after 9 years, is that it's not just the disconnect, it's a conspiracy. I may be using very strong terms, but they are just to make a point. And what is this conspiracy? Law, its language, its structures, its mechanisms, and their language, and people who are managing all of these things, they all weave a conspiracy against the common people, actually. And this is how I look at it. This is what I understand. As a person associated with law for over 2 decades now. And this is something which I have picked up from Bernard Shaw. He says that all the professions are a conspiracy against the laity, Laity. So why experiential learning? Because of these concerns that I have. And as I said, that my feet tremble when I talk about the most fundamental provision of law in India. Now, law, or teaching of law, or study of law cannot happen without the Constitution of India. And the Constitution of India cannot happen without the very first few words in the Constitution of India, that is, we the people of India. So unfortunately, we start with we the people of India, but then we leave these very people behind and we start doing law. I think to make law, its processes, its mechanisms, inclusive of masses, I think it's very important for law students and law schools and law faculty especially to engage with communities in such a way that they secure effective participation of communities in rescuing legal education from where it is now into making it real for the people, making provisions and promises of law real for masses. And I think that can only happen when there is effective engagement with communities. In my work over the last 8-9 years of engaging with communities, I have experimented with methods of clinical legal education. And the work that I am doing is actually is an experiment with learning by doing, and it is not just restricted to the classroom, that it's for the students to learn by doing, but it has gone beyond the classroom to the communities. So what I expect my students to do, I expect communities to also do the same. So there is a dialogue with communities, and communities are required to engage effectively with processes of law. It is about making masses appreciate law, be in it, be effective participants in its processes, etc. How to make this model sustainable, that's a difficult question to answer. How I have conceived this entire model is through an engagement of law school and an NGO. And that has worked to a large extent in my case, because I developed something being in an NGO, and then I came to law school, and then I secured engagement of law students and law school in working with communities. And now I am full-time with communities, thinking that how a movement can be created out of this initiative. This has to, I think this model has to sustain itself on the basis of a shift in the mindset of teachers and students, that they cannot have ways other than engaging effectively with communities in learning law. And I think that's very, very important, especially in a country like India, where this disconnect and the conspiracy, I can avoid to say, to use the term conspiracy. I can say that disconnect is getting widened, and it's a matter of serious concern. I think a law school existence of a law school and injustice in the neighborhood, one has to be questioned. Either you question the existence of a law school or you question the existence of injustice. And that's really important. In any case, if we just have to not really think in terms of law schools, educational institutions, they are supposed to spread light. And if there are darkness-ridden corners just in the neighborhood of educational institutions, they need to really think. Another point that I emphasize a lot in my work with my students and communities and law schools and law faculties is that we pursue the cause of legal education and education as a matter of trusteeship. I tell my students that you are pursuing law, you are able to pursue law because you have means to pursue law. But you are pursuing law on behalf of millions of people who would never ever know what is law, what is it all about. And at the same time, it is very important that they, even though they would never know, they be a part of law, actually, because law is about everyone. It's not about just about lawyers, judges, and those who are teaching or studying or learning law. It's about every one of us, actually. And it's about democracy, rule of law, justice, and I think all of this can only happen when educational institutions, law schools engage effectively with communities. Thank you very much.
I really appreciate Ajay Pandey sticking to the allotted time. I know he has a lot more to share, and I hope we have an opportunity to listen to some of that possibly in a Q&A session at the very end of today's presentations. I'd next like to invite Sudarshan Rodriguez. We're sticking with that order. Sudarshan, a few words about who you are and what you do for our audience.
Yeah, my name is Sudarshan Rodriguez. I'm with the Tata Institute of Social Sciences. I work in 4 domains. Environment, my background has environmental science, environmental economics, and then I did law, thinking putting all disciplines under one roof would solve problems. It doesn't. The other area I work on is disaster management, both relief and rehabilitation. Of late, I've been working on something that's relevant, which is experiential education. So I'm working on game design and gamification and creative ways of engaging for the social sector. And primarily started with environment and disasters, but now I'm looking at gender and human rights as well. How do you look at simulation games for children or even adults? My 4th domain is actually on looking at supporting and fostering young change makers, social entrepreneurs and change makers, social workers or otherwise, in the area of cultivating emotional intelligence, social intelligence, as well as systems intelligence, including learning how to design for systems change and shifting cultural norms and behaviors. We are always working at output level, so how do you look at outcome? And for us, outcome means that. So that's my professional profile. What I really care about is freedom for myself and others. I realize that if I see a lack of freedom in society, that's why I'm restless. I'll start with the work that we do at TIS. TIS, after it was founded in 1936, it was an institute of social work, the first in the country. In fact, many don't know, but after independence was handed over to government. So it's a publicly funded institution, though the name Tata still remain. So with Indian Institute of Science, TIFR, and Tata Institute, it was handed over to government. So it's a fully funded government institution. And having its seeds and its origins in social work, praxis was an important thing. And what was felt at that time, in 1936, there weren't any civil society or NGOs. So where would a social worker go and learn? So TIS had to create its own projects in looking at vulnerable and marginalized communities, and that would be the container where a social worker would go. So there were investment in actual field level projects where a social worker would learn. So there was theory. So even today, and a social worker in their first year, and this is a model of experiential learning, would spend 2 days a week in the field, either with a government institution, could be a prison or a mental health institution, it could be an NGO, school with disability, special schools, but it need not be in the domain that they were going to specialize in. So an HR student, we do have HR and labor relations, so would also do that. In the second year, they would do the same 2 days, but in their domain. So if I'm a mental health professional, I would go to a mental health institution and work there. But in the first year, it's theme neutral. So that was one. Faculty, and there's also something called fieldwork coordinators, they're social workers. They actually also go. So there's post-experience or post-field debriefing, processing. So the faculty know it's a shared experience. They've also been to the field. But the containers, the places where they go are constant for next year's batch, next year's batch. So there's a continuity. They're going to the same places. And so there's a building a volume of knowledge as well as a volume of certain contribution of change and results that they want to move. So there is a certain boundary. Of course, a student can try and create their own thing that they want to do. They also have field placements, which is like a month with the organ. And that's also fixed. Every year they're going to the same places. And faculty go and check those places out. There are criteria. And there also is, there is also a debrief. So it's not a unsupervised process. Yeah. So there's that continuity and feedback. So one of the challenges also it's not perfect. I've been working with the disaster management school to convince them that they should open a field station in Bihar in the Kosi River, which floods every year. All the work in Kosi River is always patchwork. It's band-aids. There's no long-term work. By the time you recover, your next year's flood is there. It's a systemic issue. So if we could just stop and our classes at that one, we know when it floods. We know the monsoons. So that was one thing. And we haven't really implemented, but it's a conversation that's moving because it's something that we could actually look at something more meaningful rather than the patchwork that happens every year. And patchwork is not just us. It's multiple levels of NGOs, the government, and things like that. So I think in the context of disasters, given that in today's, there are many areas where disasters occur, like monsoon, in Brahmaputra, there's a place called Majuli in the Assam, which people are actually living on the roof for that few months. They actually have layers of actually where they will start moving as it floods. So I have a colleague, a young professional, that's his project. He went there and he said, I want to sit and do something there. I think one of the other challenges is that the UGC don't look at the incentives to actually intervene for a professor or for a professor largely, teaching. It's only peer-reviewed papers, not how much advocacy you've done, how much moving, how much are you taking your relevance of your theme to society. And I think that's a big problem. So if I'm organizing a workshop like you doing, it's not so great. If I've published, say, in Times of India, a nice article about my research and trying to look at, or even if my research led to the RTI Act, let's assume that, not worth it, not in your, credit, in your ratings as a professor. And I think that needs to change. What is your relevance to society? What's your contribution to society? And that should be in the DNA of a university as well as the students. Because lots of chemical engineers can actually go and look at good water purification technologies, for example, and make a difference in society. So as projects. So can we make our projects linked? And I think it's looking at the projects today, and I think this is something maybe APU could do, is the next batch should continue the same work in the same community in those areas. Because I think if you fix containers, you're not only learning, you're doing and learning, but you're also making a difference to society. You're not extractive. It just had this problem. We were keeping going to do surveys in M-Ward. The M-Ward Human Development Index is worse than Sub-Saharan Africa. It's the slums. Most of slums are Bombay are located there. And people would say, you this survey karte kya kar rahe ho? Nothing has changed for us. And I think that's a good feedback for us to look at. Someone talked about building relationship with community in the morning. And I think that's important. And I'll give you an example of how it happened. We had an internship in 3 Delhi University students came and we had a water project in Delhi. And we said, okay, why don't you take your university and look at what you want to do? They were social work, Delhi School of Social Work students. They wanted to look at where Delhi University is located and what happened to the people that were located there and the surrounding area. And there was apparently a small, it's not a slum, but they were relocated and that's there, and they didn't have good water connections. So they engaged and created first a platform for other students to come and volunteer with them across subjects, and looked at what was really required for water problems was a simple grievance handbook or a manual where if this happens, call this number, because communities didn't have access to that, and this really helped because then they knew who to call if there was a problem or a burst pipe or leakages. And that platform now that is created is a new set of interns on come. We said we'll continue with that platform. We will ask for interns because we know we're moving a result. Because the platform is there and they're working in their own thing. They're doing audits of their own gardening, how much water for gardening, stuff like that, how much is the bill, stuff like that. There are many projects, and I think that continuity helps because we're moving a result in that area. They're also learning. And I'll go to one area of work which is very close to me, which is the tsunami rehab thing. I followed tsunami rehabilitation for 5 years till 2009-10, and I moved to TIS. I had started off with me taking a motorbike immediately after 1 week and traveling down all those villages. And I found some interesting models, actually. There were a great deal of paralegals trained by NGOs looking at entitlements and relief and looking at who's being left out, whether Dalits were being left out, how the state is enumerating relief because of ration cards or nuclear family when people might have lived in joint family, all those complications. Great work. And they invited me for a debrief and said, come and sit with us. And I'm not a lawyer, so, but I went, and very interesting feedback loops were created from that whole experience and handbooks. But there was not a single lawyer in the place, and I think it would have made a big difference. There were NGOs who had a rights-based framework. They were doing great work, and I think that a lawyer there would have been lovely to enable that, and a lawyer going to the field to see how these things actually drop off or fall through the cracks. And that, I think, is the cutting edge where you're getting direct feedback of how the law is either working or not working. It's important to look at both. But there was one thing which was I'm drawing in from Professor Bakshi's talk this morning on video, which was the anthropology of suffering. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with Veena Das's work on the Bhopal tragedy, that pain has no language. People in pain cannot express, and what they want is actually empathy. What they want is a ear to listen, right? But what is the first response of the state or legally when a disaster happens, or a plane crash or a train? What is the first thing the state responds? Compensation. That's true. And my experience of working with tsunami survivors were, they wanted to be heard. They wanted to know that nature or something has wronged them, right? Their family, their lost children. And all everybody was going was distributing relief and saying, this is your rights and entitlements. And actually, with those paralegals, I said, it's not about that. It's not a transaction of doing what your job is. Can you also listen with your open heart? Right? Now, I'm looking at a lawyer, other professionals, and this applies to any profession. The psychology of suffering is known. And when we are intervening, how does our profession, how does it inform our profession? So as lawyers, this is the question to you, because this is a law, but this applies to me as a social worker or anything, yeah? So I just want to also look at one thing, which is building on this, with this same thought, and I'll end with that. The principle here is that, compassion without justice is also meaningless. So you cultivate empathy and emotional intelligence and everything, and you have a compassionate society, and social workers who burn for justice can access that space. Of course, if you train them to be very head-heavy, they'll only look at analysis and paralysis by analysis. But I think, so, compassion without a sense of justice is not okay, it's not full. But also justice without compassion is also not whole and not enough. So I'd like to end with that note, because as lawyers, you're going into a world and, things can get very clinical. And I mentioned in the morning, bed number for a doctor, bed number, nurse number. It's a person, or case number. So I just like to end with this thing that on compassion and justice. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Sudarshan. Exactly 12 minutes. Appreciate that. I now invite R Vasavi to please share some thoughts with us.
Thank you. Uh, I'm Vasavi. I'm basically a footloose social anthropologist. And for the past 6 years, I've been working along with some friends in Chamarajanagar district, where we initiated an alternative learning program for high school and college dropouts, basically focusing on land and ecology and citizenship in the villages. But today I don't want to share any of the details of that work because it's very small and very experimental. I'd like to restrict myself more to some comments about what can be the nature of experiential education. And with that, I want to sort of commend the faculty at APU for venturing into this very important terrain, and also congratulate all the students for your wonderful projects that you've put together with so much interest and, as you've said, Sudarshan, with a lot of compassion. And all of them were very interesting, and thank you for them. I think the importance of experiential education is twofold. One is, we all know that not just universities, but all higher education or even all educational institutions have become citadels, that the outside world and its very fast-changing nature and its complexities are not being reflected in the body of knowledge that exists as codified and put into textbooks. The other reason which is linked to that is that the vast bodies of knowledge are actually being contested. And we know that, especially now, since 2008, with the huge global crisis, economic crisis, and what we are all experiencing is the coming together of that crisis with the global warming, the ecological crisis, indicates very much that much of the body of knowledge that the current world exists on, which is about 250 years of knowledge evolved from Europe, stands to be contested, and a new body of knowledge has to emerge. So in that context, that body of knowledge that must emerge across the world has to be made in conversation from the learning centers, in conversation with diverse societies and different contexts of nature. So I think that is what should be, in some ways, an overarching principle of experiential education, that there is this need for developing new bodies of knowledge. So in that, what would be some of the elements of this experiential knowledge? And I have sort of flagged this as 4 points. One, that it needs to have a very strong sense of reflexivity. And as many of you know, reflexivity means thinking about thinking, that when you have a received body of knowledge, of ideas, you question it, you contextualize it, you assess it, you see what the background is, and you rethink it for the way which you will understand and the way in which it will be used. And there are many, many ways in which reflexive knowledge or reflexivity has to be part of this experiential knowledge. I want to underscore this because in some ways this is not only because of the larger, broader context in which societies are changing, the world is changing, but the nature of the human being and the individual and the group has also changed very significantly. As many of you, if you've noticed, when we were near the earlier morning venue, the biggest hoardings were for selfie phones, mobiles. And many people have noticed, and if you travel, in buses and trains, third class, in areas where working class people, there is a strong, this taking the selfie itself has become such an act of recognition, a form of distinction. And many people have seen this taking selfies as a way of narcissism, that the youth are now so obsessed with themselves. Actually, that's not true, because selfies are an assertion, a call for recognition. And that is what large numbers of youth are doing. They're saying, I have not been recognized. Here is a chance for me to recognize myself. And here is an instrument that helps me get this recognition. So it's here in this context that we need to see recognition and reflexivity as related, as to how can we engage or make our students reflect upon not only themselves, but within those circles about the families they come from, the communities they come from, the societies they come from, and the larger roles they have within the wider world. I also would say that reflexivity requires a two-pronged perspective. It should enable those who are privileged to question those privileges. In some ways, I think your projects which you shared with us in the morning, what was exhibited, looked at that as students from a privileged university stepping out, looking at the outer world, which you may not have known about at all. But how do you question some of those privileges? And I think if experiential education doesn't have this, the idea of questioning received knowledges and received privilege, then and it cannot be just a window to another othering world. It would be very inadequate. At the same time, for those who are disadvantaged and which experiential education becomes a focus, it's to understand the systemic nature of your disadvantage, not just a private, personalized, I am poverty. Something that we constantly tell our students in the rural areas is, there are poverty and we are poor people. They always introduce themselves as, we are poor people, my family is poor. And I will say, this is a bad word. They are hardworking people and you should be actually proud of this. You have made lives on your labor and not on the wealth of your family or wealth that is inherited. Those other people who have had these privileges should actually use that as a bad word, not poverty. So how do these dual things of privilege and disadvantage, how do we make them as sources of reflexivity would be key. Apart from reflexivity, I would look at relationality. And I think although they are very closely aligned, it requires some more positioning to relate, not just to relate, but to relate to what you're seeing, to who you are seeing, who you're engaging with, and then positioning yourself and your body of knowledge would be very important. In some ways, for example, in the projects that were presented, all the students who talked about it, at least with me, were very eloquent. You could make out how engaged they were. In the project on the state between elections, the person who was talking to me, she really knew a lot. So then she said, in Gujarat, we found that the state, when we asked them, they didn't know what the state was. They didn't know anything about the state. For many, they just said the state is Modi. And I listened to all that. Then I said, to you, as what you are, a student, middle class, and from an urban area, what is the state? So she kept quiet for a while. I said, what does it mean to you? What do you think the state is for? She said, oh, I realize the state is something that runs the buses and the trains, So I appreciate that, at least she recognized that, but that is where one needs to have students go beyond. So in a context we are saying where experiential education is going out to the community, to the world that you don't belong to, seeing someone maybe disadvantaged, you need to take that knowledge back and put it back on yourself. That light has to be thrown onto you and to your own background, your experiences. The state is very, very important. We all as middle class, upper middle class people need to say, then why is the state not so important for us? Why is then the public sphere of all the nonsense and the mess that we have in India belongs to the poor and the disadvantaged, and the state has to look at it, and we have a very comfortable private sector running our lives. So therefore the corporate private sector is more important for us. So these are some of the questions I think relationality would enable students to look at. The other two quick points would be empathy, which I think Sudarshan you've already talked about, so I won't highlight that. I want to say again, as Professor Bakshi said, it is very important, again, to link the privilege to the disadvantage. Only a very empathetic perspective would put you in the shoes of the other. And I think the two projects, the one with Tibetans, the one on the riverine life, also the one on the northeastern students or people in Bangalore, did that. It was very empathetic. They looked at what is the problems, what are the troubles they face, what is their lives, etc. But I think empathy also needs a sort of a note of caution, because sometimes when you are empathetic, do you underscore and accept the life worlds of the people who you are working with? Something that I think has some legal dimensions, which I didn't see in the morning in the earlier session, was in context where there's so much complexity, where the cultures of communities are very diverse. How then do you endorse, or how do you relate to this notion? How do you assess where culture, color, issues of justice? Just to give you an example, again with our work with students, something that even the girls would say this in the villages when we are talking about gender issues, we do a lot of gender orientation. They say a rape victim's justice is when she gets married to her rapist. this is what the panchayats have been saying. This is what very old, because it's only now past 2 decades or so that rape issues have come out. Long histories of how, where rapists have been caught, they're actually married to the rape victims. And it takes a long time to say, what about the rights of the girls? What about her choice? Does she want to actually be married? Who is, and this idea of the rapist has, culprit, has, has someone who should really be behind bars or, taken away from the community, etc. That itself doesn't exist. So it's very complex as to when do you endorse what is the community's view and how do you accept it. So the final thing is to drawing on all these, I think, would be with empathy, you also expect that experiential education should lead to engagement. What do you do with that knowledge that you have, with what you've learned, what you've understood, what you've seen? I think this is very important. Engagement at different levels, whether it is sharing your material, or initiating some kind of changes, or supporting, giving, some kind of advice, or even just participating in a very deeper, engaged way, which I think would overcome this education as a citadel. So with that, I just want to close by saying that overall, experiential education is not something, I know many people nowadays look at experiential education and say, oh, this is another fad, it's diluting education, it's taking away the substance from theory. Many people have asked me, oh, all these years you were looking at, you're known as a sort of a theory person, so how come this field thing? And I also just want to end up with saying that even Kant raised these 3 key questions, that the ideal student, not just the educator, would ask these 3 questions. What must I know? What can I hope for? And what can I do? So I think experiential education captures all that, knowing, doing, and also hoping for certain things. With that, thank you.
Thanks very much, Vasavi. I would now like to invite Professor Maya Krishna Rao to please share some thoughts with us.
To start with, thank you firstly for having us all here. I'm not going to talk about myself as myself, but it occurred to me that I can actually talk about myself by talking about the different ways in which theater can be done. It's really like a big lake or a tank or a column, as we say in Malayalam. It's about how you sit at the edge of it, how you dip into it, how you dive. I learned swimming in Kerala, where I was pushed into that bottomless pit of a column where you do swimming. We're used to swimming pools, yeah, where you can see the floor. In a tank in Kerala, you can only imagine all the pythons and the snakes and the tadpoles, and the rest is left to your imagination. You know you're diving into deep danger, dangerous waters, as it were, and you just dive in. And so theater is a bit like that. So I really want to take the 12 minutes, of which I obviously have already taken 30 seconds, to place before you different kinds of scenarios of theater. And I realized actually, while he was talking, that somewhere it also reflects my own, a little life story of my own as I navigated through theater. So here's a story. And somewhere in this talk about theater, we'll be crisscrossing between life and fiction and back to life, and how fiction becomes real and the real can be fictionalized and so on. So this stepping back and forth. So here's this short story by this great theater maker, director, writer, short story writer, Bertolt Brecht. Now, Brecht took a real life incident from this town called Mainz in Germany. And the story is set, he read it, this is Depression years in Germany, somewhere 32, 33. And here goes the story. It's a 2-page story. A man, his wife, and his 2 children. He's been jobless for 3 years. A friend comes over and says, hey, listen, I've been given a big heritage an aunt in America has called me to, and so big windfall, I'm off. But I just got offered this job as a night watchman in mines, and so do you want my job? And of course, this man who has been in the depths of misery, he says, of course I'll take it. He then tells his wife, pack up the 2 kids, I'm going ahead to get the job. And he then takes a train to go to mines, and this is stories. Sometimes life is far more devastating than any fiction can create, as we all know. And as he's sitting in the train, he develops pneumonia. The girl sitting next to him tries to nurse him. He dies on the train. She gets off in Berlin with these 2 children. He goes with the 2 children and says, I'll go ahead, you pack up, he tells his wife. So he's with the children. This woman takes the man, has a grave made out for him, somehow has learnt of his name and the little bit of biography that she learnt about him in the train, buries him, takes charge of those 2 children, goes back to, I'm forgetting their place where they, the whole thing starts from, tells, the wife looks at this new woman who is an utter stranger, but who's with the 2 children. And the only thought in her mind is, how the hell do I get that job? Yeah? She doesn't have the time to grieve. These are very poignant moments. So then what does she do? This is a real life story, it's not fiction. She gets into her husband's clothes. So it's the same family of 4. This unemployed woman who with these 2 children becomes the wife of this woman who's a man today. And they get onto that same train with the 2 children, and they're off to mines to get the job. And for 12 years, this woman is a man, and what is her job? A night watchman in a factory. So here's this woman marching up and down the factory. Night skies, how wonderful. In fact, years later, I think this story somewhere must have been in my memory, and I created only in 2012, something called The Walk, which I think is also about walking under the stars. But I think the inspiration came from this night watchman. And 12 years later, her secret is discovered because a boiler bursts. This is the real story. The boiler bursts, and of course she is blown to bits. And of course it's our bodies when we take off our clothes that tell you whether we are a man, woman, or whatever grade that lies in between. Yeah? So that's the story. What does Brecht do with it? You wonder why. He shortens it from 12 years to 4 years. I'm still battling with that puzzle. I don't know why he did it. And he ends his story with, the taxman knocks on the door and says, this doesn't quite fit. You're not Mr. Hausmann. Mr. Hausmann died some time ago, and so a secret is discovered by senses, by the taxman. And this is how Brecht, as an artist, ends the story. And so she joined the ranks of those millions of people who sell their labor or sometimes even sell themselves. And then her pictures of herself as a man who lived her life as a man, dressed up as a man, were lined up on that cafe where she sometimes worked as a stewardess. These are, when you read stories like this, you're wondering, what is it to be a waitress in a restaurant where you're surrounded by pictures of yourself? Society has decided to celebrate you in a way when you led your life as a man, but today you're a waitress. Yeah? So I made a solo performance out of this in 1979 or something, a solo piece. Years later, and this is another kind of drama experience, which is where I'm at these days, is in a classroom that's dealing with how to use drama for or drama as education. We took up the same story because I've just found it so inspiring, and a completely new lens on the story is then to get the students to read the story and say, what's that moment that moves you? What's that moment where you think a multiplicity of things are happening, not just one thing? So you're giving students a way of seeing, meaning that whatever picture, I'm going to show you a picture right now, how can you look at a moment of life and say, what else is happening here? And what else is happening here? And what else is happening here? And keep pushing the question till you keep looking at the corners of the frame of the picture and you start making different connections with different points of that same photograph. You may be starting to fictionalize as well, but you are, of course you're fictionalizing. In a photograph, what is happening here, you'll first describe, oh, there are two people, and they seem to be, one is smiling, one is frowning, one is looking away, you describe what you're seeing. What else could be happening here? You're basing it on the real, but you're already taking one step, and another step, and another step. And where does this pedagogically take you? We're always, I think all the social sciences at least are, and then of course the question of justice, what is possible? What kind of a different life is possible? So here's another pedagogical thing we work with. You start with a picture or you start with an object. Is it water? Is it arsenic? Is it water that Oishik is going to come in a moment now and pour 2 drops of arsenic? I wonder why. Is it going to be that she looks very thirsty, but I'm not going to give it to her, and I'm going to say, hey, Abhay, why don't you drink that? So, how the drama will go ahead can start with an object. It all depends on what frame you give that object. And hereby lies another pedagogical principle which was talked about a lot this morning. How do you fire the curiosity, not of the students, but of yourself as a teacher? I don't think any experiential education can start with, unless there's something constantly every day when you go into the classroom, is firing the curiosity of the teacher. If you're not in that curious mode, you are I think in a mode of, I will be giving them information. I will be giving them some kind of knowledge that I've already somewhere decided. It's only when there are gaps in it, and the teacher has to create those gaps, that one can really look for, I think, what's called experiential. And I want to play devil's advocate here. A lot of the morning was spent we were talking about experiential education, and it was only very late into the morning I realized that all these, we have majority of lawyers here, all these lawyer teachers, that when they were talking about experiential education, very valid, it's about how to go out there. I would call it observe and absorb, and understand, and empathize, and feel. But I am not sure if it is experience. Now, here's the thing about drama and theater. We as actors, I started out my life as a performer. We are not taught, nobody's telling us how to empathize. It's just go play that character and you find your way into playing that character. So that's theater. What is theater in a nutshell? I take over, I throw all these people off this podium. I darken the stage. You're an audience who has decided to walk through that door and to experience, again we use the word experience, something that I'm going to lay out for you. I'm somewhere the one calling the shots. If you go to Rangashankara, it's the actors who are calling the shots. You are sitting there somewhat passively. And I don't call it passive because you're experiencing. And of course, your senses, your emotion, your head, even your physical, your blood is rushing in your body. It is an experience of a kind. But then, to cut a long story short, what they discovered was children from a very young age step into that fictional world. They'll play doctor patient, they'll play mummy papa, they will even crawl under a sheet and say, "Main baby nikalta hoon," and that's the doctor pulling out the baby. And of course they've heard that there's something a little sexy about this, but they don't know quite what it is. But they want to pull out the baby. And then you want to play life. And of course it was discovered that in this business of playing what you don't know, you're learning about life. It's one of your first lessons of life, even much before the parent is telling you. So what is this thing about children entering drama without anybody prompting them? Why aren't we using it as a methodology for learning and teaching? And that's, I think, one of the starting points of how to, in a formal way, start using the understanding, the methodology, the words we use, and of course what theater did, and all good disciplines do this, I think, which is to say, I'll just beg, borrow, and steal from everything I know around me, from sociology, from history, from politics, and make this new thing called, and that's what we call drama. Drama is never played again. It's that one time when we will, either in a classroom or in a prison or in that Indo-Pak border, set up where all of us will not be divided as participants, as audience and actors. We will all be in a zone together. We've told ourselves we want to be able to learn or gain some significance from this experience together. There may be one or a group of leaders who we call facilitators, sometimes an abused word. But a good facilitator never, ever teaches, only creates the grid. And that grid has to be so super. And what's so super about it, in my way of looking at it and from what I've practiced, you firstly have to fire the imagination of those participants, whoever they are, and something has to just draw them to that material that's there. You might have talked to an organizer like he's around, hey, what do you want from these sessions, these 2-day sessions? He'll tell you something. But you have to then translate it into drama and say, how do I create what he's told me in a fictional situation? Now, here goes another pedagogical thing. When we say learning through or of drama, we never mean that you're only going to do drama. It's about planning. This good facilitator must be able to plan. If I have to be able to generate significant teaching and learning that will go back and forth between me or us as facilitators and them, how do I begin to plan stages of this, of which I don't even know how they're going to reveal themselves, these stages? I don't know. They may have only 3 stages, and here I'm going to give you an example of what we actually do in a classroom in this program that we call, I know, and this 12 minutes, how much winding up time, my. So, here's an example. So, here's a lesson in, and I'm not saying this is only true for school classrooms. It can be done right here in a law class, and this, by the way, is my dream. I'm placing it here, that I don't think drama and education or theater and education can be a discipline taught and studied on its own, but I think it's a methodology because it's truly experiential. We use our head, our heart, our body, and we're actually there. And we're all going to learn from it. That if we are using all our faculties, it must be a great way of social learning. It's not about self-development. It's about socially learning from each other. So, here's a lesson from a class 5 environmental science textbook. I can't remember the title. The story is Jatre Bhai, who started off in a village. He's been told, pack your bags, you've got to move out because the river is going to be turned into a dam. So he packs his bags, he goes to another place, Sinduri, where he's made to. It's the Narmada story. And then he goes, then everything is very alien to him. And then he packs his bag again because some relative in Bombay says, yahan aa jao. And the story actually starts with Bombay, where he's looking at this television screen. He's wondering why his daughter is looking at that television screen. He's wondering why his son hasn't come back from whatever jugadu job he does in Bombay. So this man is sitting there wondering, ye main kahan pahunch gaya hu? That's how it starts. Now, the teacher will never, a good drama and education teacher will never ever say to her students, okay, shall we become those villagers? Because you know very well that for at least an urban child knows, children are the worst actors. So we never talk about acting. We only talk about belief. We never talk about going into that village. And I get throwing these pedagogical things only because I think there are some things that you also use. What is the particular and what is the universal? So the particular in this Jatre Bhai story is of a man who kept hopping from one town to another because a dam was getting built in his village. What's the universal? And the facilitator has to ask, what's the universal in this? And maybe you come down to the word loss. He's losing home. Children in the classroom know what loss is. They lose friends. They lose a city because their father or mother gets transferred. They know the meaning of loss. So can I get them to enter this story through the thing of loss? The teacher then decides, how can I, this is part of the course, and I leave it at that, how do I, without any theater experience, no acting, I'm scared of it, I hate theater, but I love saying, what if? So the teacher were to say, what if I was Jatre Abhay, those last few moments when I was packing my bags, how could a teacher start a 35-minute class which is about loss and yet getting to get this word empathy, for the children to empathize with Jatre Bhai, start with his gamcha, a photograph of his father, and he's packing up and he's speaking his thoughts aloud. And the drama starts there with the teacher, but after that, she does it in a way that the children are so driven with curiosity that she can hand over the reins to them, and they then make the rest of the story. With her always as the guide, because she wants them to learn about loss, cope with it, find ways around it, and I leave it at that.
Thank you. Thanks, Maya. Maya did some magic with the time. We, without any further ado, we move to our next panelist who's joining us via video message. We have two short clips from Professor Nandini Sundar, based at the Delhi School of Economics, a sociologist well regarded for her intervention into particular legal matters as well.
Petitioner in this case, to think about the role of an academic in terms of theory and practice, in terms of what goes on inside the university and how that has influenced your work outside with tribal rights and ownership of natural resources and things. How your work outside has influenced discussions that you have inside the university.
I think I learned a lot from the case in terms of just finding out how the law works, and not just in terms of how the law works as in the content of the case, but things like giving dasti or all the kind of little tweaky bits of the law which are about the practice of filing, which I found quite interesting. But in terms of how this relates to the university and the legal work, well, one is that the legal work, the case came entirely out of my academic background, because my PhD was on Bastar and I've been visiting it for several years. So it's only because I had that connect to the place that I wanted to file the case. And there's a clear connection there. In terms of what I learned from the case and how that feeds back, I teach a course on the sociology of law, an MA course. And I think it sort of helps me with examples. It helps me with, just a way of making the subject a bit more interesting at particular moments, although a lot of what we teach is quite theoretical. It also, in a sense, because one of the things that we teach is one of the things that I like to teach is the rule of law. And in a sense, that's something on which there is so much debate about how you describe it, how you see it, whether it's seen as something that is an unmitigated good, the E.P. Thompson idea that regardless of the fact that law is hegemonic, that it's an instrument of the ruling classes, there is something about the rule of law which is an unmitigated good. And at some level, one has to agree with that in the sense that when nothing else is there, at least the law is there to keep some semblance of democracy alive. But on the other hand, when you look at how the law actually works in practice, it's really debatable about as to whether there is anything like the rule of law. And then there is a lot of other literature on how the rule of law is just a kind of hegemonic idea to make people think that the state is working when it's not working really. So I think I don't teach my case, but it informs what I teach.
Is there a level of involvement, for example, that your current students have in your work outside the university? How do you negotiate things like that?
For a long time, I never actually talked about the case in the department. I mean, it's only in the last year or two, in fact, when I've not been so involved in the case, that I've taught about it in class as well. I've just sort of described it. But otherwise, I think there has to be that separation. Yeah, I mean, I think not because of the law case, I mean, not in terms of the Salvajurum litigation, but I think that really the university has to open up a lot more to things that are happening outside. We really need to have a lot more people from different walks of life come and talk to students and use their material in our curricula. And if you think of the way that the university system in India is designed, it destroys a lot of indigenous knowledge that people might have had. So if you think of sort of agricultural knowledge, right? If like you have 70,000 rice varieties in Chhattisgarh, there are 400,000 plant formulations in all the different systems of medicine, Unani and Ayurveda, etc. But what gets taught in college, in an agricultural college, etc., would be just a sort of minor portion of this. And then as people feel that they get educated, they sort of lose that connect with other kinds of skills that could have been developed. So there's a huge kind of mismatch between formal education and the kind of skills that there are in the country. And formal education is, in a sense, destroying that resource base. Or it's happening or developing outside of formal education. So there are serious problems in what we're teaching and how we're teaching it. Government wants to shut down all the universities, especially social science departments, as far as anyone can tell. I mean, they have stopped funding anybody. All the research scholars have stopped getting funding. They've cut down seats. They want to determine our curriculum in some kind of standard fashion across the country. They don't want us to do research. They don't give us any leave to do research. So as far as the government goes, they have absolutely zero interest in social science education. They may have some interest in technical education, but even that is clearly not the case, because if their view of science is that we had plastic surgery because of Ganesha's head, then really you can't be interested in science if you have no basic sense of science. So let's not even talk about this government, which is the most not just anti-intellectual, but just, it's going to ruin the educational system for the next God knows how many years by putting in all sorts of ill-equipped people into the system. And the problem is that we're going to see the effects lasting a long time. So I don't think that if you leave it to government, that the future of education is very inspiring. But if people are able to kind of fight back and protect some kind of autonomy within the system, then there might be hope. But again, we're talking about very few institutions, really. Like, if you look at the vast majority of colleges in this country, they're all state government funded or private funded, in which anyways people don't have any autonomy, people are scared to talk. How many people do you see from private colleges writing in the newspapers? How many people do you see? I mean, yes, a few from Jindal and APU and all that, but that's a different type of, we're talking about the vast majority are anyways silenced, anyways teaching shops. So I'm not sure that this government has, or the government before that had really thought through education at all.
Do you have a view on how education institutions should be reacting to this climate? What they should be doing?
Well, obviously we need to kind of hang in there, try and ensure that we at least have the freedom to teach what needs to be taught. Because with this CBCS coming in, there's a real danger of this kind of standardized curriculum being taught across all universities. And I don't really see much resistance coming to all these, against all these changes. I mean, there's so much focus on JNU and how they're resisting, but that's just one small kind of blip in the whole educational scene. And most people have just sort of given in. So I think we're headed for fascism, and unless it's really, really serious. Right now, there's nothing kind of hopeful on the scenario unless you really fight. Unless different people come together and build up movements and so on. Yeah, no, I'm sorry if I've sounded really pessimistic and bleak about what's happening, but I think what's important is to always remember what Gramsci said, that one needs pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will, because I think the situation will get better if people organize, if we are concerned about what's happening and we do take up issues and we keep fighting in wherever we are, and whether you're in the courts or you're in the universities to try and ensure some standards, it will change and things will get better, but it's going to be a long fight.
Thanks. We have Ajujon, the craftsman interviewer who took these lovely interviews, Professor Bakshi and Professor Nandini Sundar. Aju, can you take a bow somewhere? Okay, there you are. Thank you. Thanks for joining us, and thanks very much for bringing these people to Bangalore for us. Finally, we have Ramesh, who is going to close up our keynote panel for today. You're going to be using this, so I think we'll all continue to stay where we are. Ramesh, the floor is yours. Please do tell us a little bit about who you are and what work you're up to. Mike?
All right, thank you all so much for having me. I'm very, very grateful to be invited here. I'm an American citizen of Indian descent, so it's actually wonderful for me to get to come to India this often. I've been coming almost every year for about the last 10 years. Thank you, Abhay. Thank you, Rachel, for inviting me. It's interesting how my short talk comes right on the heels of those words, because many of the words that were just said are paralleled in our experience in the United States right now. So there's some incredibly uncanny and dystopic parallels. So I'll start my talk with a little bit of pessimism, but then I'm going to go into optimism and inspiration, because my main point that I want to make is that it's extremely important for us to think about how to support and be in service of those phenomena that are either movements-based or collaboration-based that we are inspired by. We need to retrieve and gather our heart and our spirit as we develop projects that are community-based, that represent anti-hegemonic sorts of alternatives to what we see occurring. So this is the cover of my book, and you might notice this book came out in the US, but I think it's available here, and it's about to be released on an Indian press just in a few months. So you'll probably see too much of me here. So this book is called Whose Global Village? And some of you probably know what the term global village represents, but basically I'll just tell you, the global villages was a prophesized term in the 1960s by Marshall McLuhan that was supposed to represent an electronic instantaneous technology that was supposed to connect us all over the world, essentially flattening the world, transforming the world into a village. And these notions of flattening and governmentality and governance, all kind of brought up in my colleagues' previous talks, are implicated as we think about the internet today, which is exactly the space in which I work. I'm interested in the question of whose global village are we speaking about, or more explicitly, whose voices are dominating our discussions and conversations around digital technology, who is monetizing these systems, who's profiting from these systems, whose modes of surveillance, control, and power are being articulated and empowered through the internet as it stands today. And what I want to argue is we need to decenter and fragment these modes, because what is occurring right now in the world is two major platforms are dominating our experience of the internet. Anyone want to guess? It's Google and Facebook. And these are Western corporations based in Silicon Valley that see the world, ontologically speaking, in Western ways and follow Western specific place-based political economies. And you might think, oh, I have friends who work for Google. I have friends who work for Infosys who have contracts with Google. But the question is whose voice and whose agendas dominate those forms of IT developmentalism. And I want to think past that and overcome that through my work. And that's essentially what I'm attempting to do in my work. So we have very strange days right now in the United States. We let Frankenstein out of the laboratory, right? You might have your own version of ways of talking about Prime Minister Modi. I'll let you all say those words. But what's interesting in our incredibly surreal, or one might say hyper-real moment in the United States is that this is not Donald Trump. This is Alec Baldwin, who's a very famous comedian and actor, and this is a Dominican Republic newspaper that's reporting on something in relation to Donald Trump, but actually he is using Alec Baldwin's picture. So the simulacra, the signified, has become the signifier, right? So it's a very interesting moment, and what this speaks to is not just the takeover of political power by, I would say, the monsters and Frankensteins, I'll keep using that word, of fascism or neo-fascism, but actually how the technologies that we always dreamed about and idealized and prophesized as being fundamentally democratic, grassroots, revolutionary, and so on, are actually turning the world upside down. Because as we've learned, and I've been doing a great deal of media outreach since my book came out with CNN, MSNBC, Al Jazeera, so on, as we've learned since this happened, 220 million Americans, which is about 75% or more of the voting public, have had 50,000 pieces of data gathered about them that were analyzed to develop psychometric profiles of their behavior, right? So like, you're kind of neurotic, Abhay, I'm very open. That's not true. You know, and so I'm going to feed you particular types of political content to influence your disposition, because Americans, and maybe it's also true in India, have turned to these platforms that are opaque black boxes to get their news of the world. We see the world through lenses that are disarticulated from our control and agency. So my work and my lab's work, I lead a lab that brings together scholars and activists, computer scientists, humanists, ethnographers, designers, legal scholars. We're all coming together across the University of California system. I teach at UCLA since 2005. We're coming together to think about alternatives, an alternative model for thinking about digital cultures and digital activism. So it's very important in that sort of space to think about communities, to think about modes of inspiration, to think about how we can work with people in the spirit of praxis. And that's not just name dropping that term. All of our papers are co-authored with our community partners. All of our projects are step away from studying communities. I'm not interested in studying a community. I'm interested in writing about our collaborations and leaving that community while being of service with that community. Letting things maintain their sovereignty. That was a term that was just used, sovereignty and autonomy. These are the kinds of modalities we need to contest these systems of techno-capital and techno-political power. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about two different projects. I've worked for about 15 to 20 years as a field-based researcher, but I myself, I forgot to say who I was. I myself am a combination of an engineer, a humanist, and a designer. So I'm sort of a strange guy in a very typically, I guess they call us ABCDs, right? So, you all know what that means, I'm sure. So basically, the work I've been doing has been based in different places where I've seen inspirational practices and movements occur, or projects where I've been invited by communities to develop various types of technologies that contest these sorts of modalities that I really briefly described. From 2011 to 2014, essentially, I was living off and on in Tahrir Square in Egypt. I was living there trying to understand this is Tahrir Square, and trying to understand why this Western manufactured narrative was being told about people that were fighting for social and economic and political justice, right? You know what this is, right? Facebook revolution. I think you heard it here, right? And I was really interested in how that could be the case and how that's actually not the case. And in so doing, I was working with community organizations, labor organizers, and so on. And we were actually looking at what people were actually doing, telling stories about the agency, courage, power of people and communities. So in so doing, we saw examples such as this. This is a project by a bunch of activists in Egypt who realized that most people in the country are not online. Most people in the country who do go online might see something and think they're politically participating, but they're actually just looking at their screen. You all know what I mean, right? So what do? They take content online and repurpose it, new assemblages, project it offline, into offline spaces. So my lab is doing projects like this. We have collaborations with the Black Lives Matter movement, which is something I mentioned earlier. So these are inspiring movements. So we want to know, how can we help you? How can we be of service to you? How can we write about our collaboration without at all endangering your privacy or your security? Because trust me, these things are, there's an attack dog after all of these movements. A second thing we're working on right now is we're looking at drones. I don't know if you realize this, but drones are increasingly coming, and there's a privatization of our airspaces that are coming as a function of drones. A third project we're working on is with Native American communities that one of my colleagues in our lab is a Native American woman herself. And we've been invited by a set of communities to develop projects that empower Native American modalities of knowing, Native American ontologies in relation to issues around climate change, and trying to empower the diffusion of those narratives to essentially humanize this and not just make it a scientific phenomena, which is great. Right now, the scientists are absolutely our allies against what's going on, but also empowering the human, the stories, as you pointed out so well, the stories, the human, the embodied, the performative. So we're looking at these issues. So I want to talk to you about the current project I'm working on. Hopefully, if you'll allow me, Abhay, show a very short video, like 2 minutes of a video. And let me just show a little bit about this project. Okay. So basically, this project is focused on economic and communication rights, right? Like I was telling you, most of my initiatives and my projects that I collaborate on are modes of inspiration where I can somehow collaborate and be of service, either find ways to bring funding in, find ways to bring students in to support and live with communities, to figure out ways to be non-interventionists, non-extractionists, but to support and serve. That's the goal here on every level that we can. So this project is the coolest project ever. Basically, what's occurring, this is in the cloud forest regions of southern Mexico. This is where I'm working now. So all my fieldwork's being done in Spanish, and this is really complicated. But of course, the languages being spoken with the communities that I'm working in is not Spanish. They're speaking their indigenous Zapotec languages, which is about 36 different versions of these Zapotec languages. Different distinct languages are being practiced. And these communities are living in cloud forest regions all around the city of Oaxaca. It's an amazing part of the world. It's something like, I think a lot of Indians would love it there because it reminds you of like the Cordy Hills or things like that, right? So these communities have been disenfranchised by telecom systems. I think we know this story, right? Like, so the telecom companies don't want to invest there unless they charge incredibly high rates because the infrastructure itself is one that they want to monetize. Not enough people, not enough money, not enough of a return on investment. So what are these communities doing? They're building their own cell phone networks, organized as collectives. And I think that this is an interesting approach toward how we might think about the internet moving forward. Not only do we have to think about security, privacy, encryption, we know all that stuff. I have colleagues here who know more about that stuff than me, but this is I'm writing about as well. Not only do we have to do that, but we have to think about alternatives, alternative assemblages. The rhizome has to reproduce itself in new forms. And this is what I'm looking at here. These are communities that have basically built and engineered their own cell phone systems using open source hardware and software. They're daisy chaining these systems to one another. They own the network. They pay 1/100th the price that they would if they subscribe to this exploitative economic model. And guess who wants to buy this network? Facebook does. And why do they want to buy this? Because data, I like saying this a lot, data is the new oil of the economy. All right? Data is the oil, actually I got it wrong. Data is the oil of the new economy. So this is what's occurring. And it's really interesting in these moments where I'm writing about this project, trying to help in any way using my technical background and trying to publicize and push for funding and sustainability. Me and my students are working on this. You see that sometimes you can build alliances. You can have allies. And this is kind of funny, but Al Jazeera Plus is one of our allies because they've publicized this project, so it's developed so much global support. A couple million people saw this video that now the Mexican government is under incredible amounts of pressure not to shut this down. And this is very similar to an example that was incredibly inspiring for me. I was very young at that time. That also occurred in Mexico in 1993. This was the Zapatista movement. This was a rebellion movement that came out of indigenous communities in southern Mexico and Chiapas. And these guys communicate with one another, not only in their own indigenous languages, but they also use CB radio between their communities. However, they and their allies were also using the internet. Back in the day, some of us might remember, this was called Usenet forums. They were getting people to post on Usenet to publicize this story. So much so that it created a global network of sympathy. So you can move from the local to global to create alternative types of formations. So with those words, I just want you to see a couple minutes, if that's okay, of this amazing project, and you can hear how inspiring this is. So I just want us to imagine and be inspired because we know things are messed up, right? But we don't need to sit and lie on that. We have agency, we have power, we have sovereignty. So let me show this video very quickly. Just a couple minutes of it, and then I'll send it to you.
La autonomía en sí es, bueno, desde mi saber Shida, lo entiendo como el poder construir cosas, hacer cosas con lo que tengamos, o sea, la autonomía construida desde nuestra visión, ¿sí? Sin depender tanto de cosas que vengan de fuera y que a veces rompan con la forma de vida, la forma de visión que tenemos nosotros como zapotecos. Primero empezamos con la radio, en sí, la radio. ¿Por qué? Porque aquí no teníamos, o los medios de comunicación que nos llegaban noticias de Veracruz, que es el que más estamos cerca. Nos llega la televisión, las grandes televisiones nos llega, pero de la región no había nada, o sea, nadie nos decía qué estaba pasando en un pueblo, qué había en otro, en esto. Entonces dijimos, vamos a establecer una radiodifusora. Y empezamos con la radiodifusora, dimos primer paso a nuestra autonomía. Andando en esto, tocamos puertas, decía la gente, es que necesitamos cómo comunicarnos por teléfono. Fuimos a las oficinas de Telmex para teléfonos domiciliarios. Lo primero que nos dijeron es que son pueblo chiquito.
Empiezan esta reunión en Talea con 30 autoridades comunales, escriben una carta a la SCT diciendo por no sé cuántos años hemos estado pidiendo este servicio, no se ha cumplido y nosotros ahora hemos investigado y vemos que hay esta parte de la ley que nos ampara y nosotros mismos vamos a empezar a dar nuestros propios servicios.
Bueno, poco. Antes, cuando no había el celular comunitario, íbamos en los teléfonos de acá, que está el Telmes y el otro Telecom, algo así es. Pero por ejemplo, nosotros siempre hablamos 9 minutos, que es lo que hablamos a Oaxaca en celular. Es que ya debemos tener a la mano 85 hasta 90 pesos. Pero nosotros, por ejemplo, pagamos 30 pesos al mes, que es lo que tenemos que pagar cada mes. Entonces, si tenemos 10 pesos, 20 pesos, 30 pesos, lo que nos da alcance a nosotros, entonces eso es lo que ponemos, el crédito, dijéramos.
Pues aquí los jóvenes lo utilizan mucho para comunicarse, así como que ya ahorita tienen más libertad de expresión, así hablándose ahí, y más con los amigos que tienen novia y más libertad tienen ahí.
el gran porqué de hacer eso y de habernos metido en tantas cosas tan complejas. Es por necesidad. Las comunidades de Oaxaca y muchas comunidades rurales de México y del mundo han sido totalmente dejados fuera de poder ejercer su derecho a la comunicación. Y en ese sentido, eso es lo que motiva el proyecto, encontrar soluciones a escala humana que pueden permitir que las personas ejercen su derecho a la comunicación.
Okay, so there's more to that, but I just want to kind of look at that as an example, right? This is another model, right? This is a model where the epistemologies and ways of knowing a people and communities are articulated into technology. It's not just us giving up all our data to these, black box corporations, right? And these are other models of thinking about questions of social justice in relation to pedagogy, our own roles as scholars who are fundamentally activists, and being of service to people. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ramesh. Thanks for rushing through that. I appreciate it. So I was hoping we'd have some time for questions, but unfortunately we have run out of time. So I'm going to invite you to first join me in applauding each one of our brilliant panelists. Thank you. I would like to invite each and every one of you to join us for dinner. Dinner will be at Highgates Hotel, which is just across the road, a minute's walk from here. And maybe some of your questions and conversations that these panelists have started can continue over dinner. Very quickly, a quick word of thanks to Numa, of course, for the use of your beautiful space. Naresh, Malati, and Anil have been wonderful and have been very supportive in allowing us to use this space, so thank you. Finally, I'd like to thank each and every one of you who through the course of the day made what I think is something special happen. Thank you and have a good night. We hope to see many of you tomorrow.